Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Fantastic guest today. Many of you may have known this story, but I actually, in many ways, owe my career to this guy. When I first came to Washington, D.C. a billion years ago, I was doing an informational job interview for this guy, Ben Wattenberg, at the American Enterprise Institute, and he asked me what the latest book I read was, and I said, well, I've been reading this guy, Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and the Last Man, and he was like, I never understood, what is that about? And even though I was only about 14 pages into the book, my answer was sufficiently competent sounding, keyword there being sounding, that was apparently the tipping point, and they gave me the internship, which was led to a job, which led to a decade at the American Enterprise Institute, and since then, not just out of loyalty to that, and I have subsequently finished the book, but not just out of loyalty to that, but I've been one of the leading defenders of the end of history thesis. Sometimes I would argue it sounded like I'm more of a defender of it than our guest here today, Francis Fukuyama. He is the author of many books. He's probably up there with Paul Johnson of authors I've gotten the most out of over the years. The Origins of Political Order, two-part series, was instrumental and indispensable for my last book. And anyway, you are at I'm doing this from a different computer, so all my notes are not with me, but you're still, you're at Stanford?
Yes, I am.
And you have a Substack and many other things.
Yeah.
What else should I be mentioning that I don't have in front of me? I apologize.
I helped start an online journal called American Purpose, and
that's what I was struggling
subsequently merged with Persuasion, Yasha Monk's Persuasion.
That's right.
And so now we are a Substack underneath Persuasion, if you want to see what I've been up to. Great.
Okay. So one of the things that put it in mind to have you back on here was I saw that Patrick Deneen had taken something of a victory lap over something that you had written in the Financial Times, saying that the election of Donald Trump, well, the way he put it was, in effect, that the election proved a complete rejection of liberalism in America, which I think was an overstated version of what you actually said, which was that this was a setback for liberalism and a rejection of it as constituted in the political contest, but not necessarily the end of liberalism in America. But anyway, can we use that as a sort of a jumping off point about what you think the state of liberalism, classical or otherwise, in America is, 2 weeks into the Trump administration?
Right. Well, where to begin? I think that, my analysis of liberalism was that it had taken a couple of wrong turns over the last generation.
Mm-hmm.
So one of those was on the right, where so-called neoliberalism, this is a kind of Milton Friedman, libertarian, markets will solve every problem kind of view, led to a lot of economic inequalities and, instability in financial markets and the like. But there was also what you might call woke liberalism, in which identity politics had actually displaced classical liberalism. Classical liberalism believes in the equality of all human beings, the equal dignity of all human beings. And identity politics, begins to tear that apart into particular groups that have been historically marginalized and focuses attention on them. Now, Deneen, identifies liberalism with woke liberalism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if that's your definition of liberalism, then he's right. There is a across-the-board rejection by many Americans of DEI and that form of identity politics. And it's interesting that on the right, there's also been a rejection of neoliberalism, the economic version of it, with criticisms of corporations and, working class people being left behind. But that's not the core of liberalism. The core of liberalism is a system of rule of law that protects the rights of individuals, limits the power of government. And actually, as the Trump administration is unfolding, it does seem to me that they're not going to just roll back woke liberalism. They're actually going to attack a lot of the core principles of liberalism, the rule of law itself. And I don't think that's what Patrick Deneen wants or thinks is the agenda of a post-liberal society. But that's in fact what we're getting, and that attack has been really evident since January 20th.
So I agree with almost all of that. I just push back a little bit insofar as if you read Regime Change and the End of Liberalism, I think he's definitely primarily dislikes woke liberalism. He also dislikes neoliberalism,
right?
And one can make an argument that he is at minimum somewhat hostile to classical liberalism, right? I mean, there's this school of post-liberals. He's among them. He's on the smarter end of the distribution among them. But Adrian Vermeule and some of these others, their argument is basically that everything started going south since Locke, and I think that's a huge stolen base, and it is not something that a lot of Americans don't know who John Locke was, and they may not be Lockeans in some theoretical sense, but as a cultural sense, America is still a very liberal country, wouldn't you say?
Well, look, that part of Deneen's argument I think is just so ridiculous that that's the reason I didn't mention it, because I can't believe that anyone takes it seriously. I mean, liberalism was born in the 17th century out of the wars of religion, where
Right.
Protestants and Catholics couldn't live with each other. And the liberals said, let's not introduce religious doctrine into our politics. Let's tolerate different religious approaches, because life itself is more important than living the good life as defined by one particular religious tradition. And, Deneen, he's argued that that's wrong, that we should go back. He disguises what his agenda is as, what he calls a teleological view of man. Basically, Americans should agree on a higher goal that's really defined essentially by conservative Catholicism, and that we should unite around that particular vision of the good life. It's just, both theoretically and as a practical political objective, it's so ridiculous that I don't know why anybody takes that seriously. And so in that respect, I actually think that he does remain actually a classical liberal, in that he must know at some level that this is not anything that's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with this. George Will likes to say that small ideologically committed minorities change the world, and he's absolutely right about that. And you can point to the Bolsheviks, you can talk to the American founders, you can point to all sorts of small groups of committed people who have moved the wheel of history. What the problem is that there's a certain winner's bias to that, because there are lots of small ideological movements that go the way of the Shakers, right, and that die out. And so the question I struggle with is how seriously to take post-liberalism on the right as someone who cares deeply about who thinks American conservatism is not wholly, but is essentially part of conserving classical liberalism. I struggle with how seriously to take a lot of those arguments, or Curtis Yarvin and some of these other people, or do you ignore them? And given their place in the Trump firmament, I feel sometimes that it would be foolish just to completely ignore all of that, as long as I think all of that stuff is.
Yeah, well, as you've indicated, one of the big problems is that there's no agreement among these different people as to, what actually constitutes the core of post-liberalism. So Adrian Vermeule, it's some version of Catholic integralism. I think Deneen is close to that, but he doesn't quite say it explicitly. Curtis Yarvin, believes in some form of vitalism, or some pagan pre-Christian doctrine, and they're going to have trouble recruiting people, Americans, to this. I mean, if they don't stop disagreeing among themselves as to what it is that's going to replace liberalism, they're not going to get many people to sign up for their parade. So yeah, I guess that's why I'm not too worried about that. Ever since Trump was elected, you have conservative intellectuals that have been trying to fill in the blanks
Hmm.
because Trump himself is pretty much devoid of any kind of theory. And they want to justify Trump's policies and the kinds of outcomes that Trump wants in terms of a higher system of thought. You know, this happened with Reaganism, but there you actually had some serious intellectuals that defended it. I mean, the
Hmm.
whole Milton Fried. I mean, this is the origins of neoliberalism, right? That you
Hmm.
had the Chicago School, you had Nobel Prize winning economists that really did have a kind of serious intellectual framework for explaining why markets would produce good outcomes and why America was overregulated. And I just think that people on the right today are still thrashing around, trying to come up with that highbrow explanation of what they're doing.
No, I agree with that entirely. My longstanding explanation is that any attempt to impose a coherent philosophical program to Trumpism will eventually embarrass the people who put it forward, because eventually he brags about how he goes with his instincts and he contradicts himself and he thinks that's a function of his brilliance. And so inevitably there is only one safe harbor, which is the cult of personality stuff. Is you just simply say, I trust him to make the right decision, because any other coherent program or theory of the case, he's going to contradict at some point. And you're then going to be pressed with the obligation to either show political loyalty to him and abandon your theory of the case, or stick with your theory of the case and piss off Trump world because you're saying, no, actually, tariffs don't work, or whatever it is. It doesn't really matter. It happens routinely. And I think, one of the last groups that was a holdout that managed the first Trump era pretty well were the conservative legal movement.
Right.
And I think that they're due. It's their turn to
Yeah.
get roughed up quite a bit in the years to come. Anyway, we can go into the theory stuff more. I have some other stuff I want to ask you about all that, but we should go back to the sort of grubby world of rank punditry. I listened to your conversation with Yasha Monk, which I thought was great. And one of the points where I think we agree is that I was saying in the lead up to the election that the problem with a lot of my saner conservative friends was that they were working from an assumption that the best case scenario was also the most likely scenario, which would be that it would be a repeat of Trump 1. But this
Right.
doesn't look like a repeat of Trump 1, does
No,
it?
no, not at all. Yeah, I think that Trump has turned out to be worse than anyone expected. Yeah, this was an annoying argument I had with some of my kind of more centrist conservative friends who simply didn't think that Trump was that much of a threat and was actually under the surface a kind of normal Republican. I think the first indication of that were just these appointments that he made to his cabinet, which were
Mm-hmm.
just, I mean, Kash Patel, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr. I mean, it bespeaks like, oh, Matt Gaetz, who's
Sure.
fortunately not in the picture anymore. I mean, it just speaks to a complete contempt for American government that is way beyond, any other kind of Republican politician that I can think of. I can't imagine another candidate that would have appointed people like that. And, the use that Trump is making of Elon Musk to basically um, uh, sort of undermine the American state is really unprecedented. It's something we didn't expect. The other thing that really was not in the cards was this foreign policy dimension. I think most people would have said that Trump was an isolationist, and that was his basic um, theme in foreign policy. But it turns out he's also an expansionist. He
Mm-hmm.
actually cares about the territorial extent of the United States, and that was something he did not mention. During the whole campaign, and then all of a sudden, we have to deal with Greenland and Panama and this sort of thing. So, um, yeah, I think that. I'd like to go back to some of these conservative friends and say, yeah, so now what do you think?
No, look, as someone who's also been a defender of neoconservatism as an intellectual movement going back to Irving Kristol and all that, I've been called a warmonger for 20 years, and there's not a neocon in the universe who ever talked about retaking the Panama Canal or intimidating a NATO ally into giving up Greenland. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, it's weird. But you're the first person I've heard use what I think is the best poli-sci way of understanding Trump, which is he's a personalist, right? Can you sort of explain how that is? Because this to me seems to be more of it's a better concept for explaining not just Trump, but also Xi and a lot of regimes around is it's sort of a backdoor kind of monarchism kind of approach, which just says the will and the wisdom of a leader is the determinant of good policy.
Well, I think that, one of the most fundamental grounds of Western civilization has been the belief in institutions that, we should have a government of laws and not of men. I mean, phrases like that, where you want a system that is not dependent on a particular individual, because that individual may be great and charismatic and may do great things, but then who succeeds that individual? And that's why, we've settled on things like constitutional government, rule of law. These are all durable rules for governing our society that are not dependent on having necessarily good people. And in fact, one of the great points of wisdom of the founding fathers was that, they read Roman history. They understood that you could get ambitious people that would do terrible things, and therefore you needed to structure those institutions to prevent them from doing that. And personalism is the opposite of that. It's saying, no, it's all about individuals. We don't particularly care about the laws. If we've got, a great leader in front of us, we basically will do whatever we want. Now, I will have to say that actually a good government has to draw on both. It has to have that institutional framework for continuity, for stability, and so forth. But it also requires good leadership. And there's certain things that the best laws are simply not going to accomplish if you don't have vision, willingness to innovate, willingness to take risks, and so forth. And so it is a balance between, some degree of personalism embedded in a system of rules and law. But, essentially what we're seeing now is the casting aside of the institutions and then, just pure willfulness. And, anybody that thinks that an 80-year-old president, is the cat's meow have to ask themselves, what happens when he's not there? Who takes over? Who's got that kind of charismatic authority if you're not going to rely on rules and law? And then the worst outcome is if, from henceforth we actually abandon the idea of institutions and, simply hope for another charismatic leader to arise.
Well, but that does point to look. I'm fairly dismayed about how the first 2 weeks have gone, and I think things will get worse before they get better. But at the same time, as you say, he's an 80-year-old guy, and do you think whether he serves out the full 4 years or the actuary tables play their part? Do you think that the changes that he is wreaking are, I don't want to use the word permanent, but long lasting? Do you think that a J.D. Vance could come in and have the same sort of, Weberian charismatic quality that would demand the kind of loyalty tests that we have now with Donald Trump?
Well, I think that Trump is kind of a unique genius in that respect. I really don't see any successor to him. Maybe Elon Musk, but he wasn't born in the United States, so he can't run for president, fortunately. I don't really see anybody that could. And also, Trump is a really good speaker, and Elon is not, right? So, but no, I don't see anybody. But I do think he's done serious damage. The second book I wrote was a book called Trust, in which I talked about the importance of trust. That one was focused on the economy, but it's also critical in politics, because we delegate authority to leaders to do the right thing, to make decisions. And we also have to work with each other in civil society, in political parties, in kind of everyday life. And trust is this incredible lubricant that makes that kind of social cooperation work better. One of the reasons that Scandinavia has been so successful is that they're very small, homogeneous societies, and there's a very high level of trust between citizens and the government, so on and so forth. Now, we as Americans have always had trouble with that, although in civil society, there's a long tradition that goes back to Alexis de Tocqueville that said that Americans are joiners. They spontaneously learn how to work together in civil society organizations. A lot of them are based on religion, and we have a very dense network of that kind of organization. And I think that one of the most troubling long-term consequences of Trumpism is a deterioration across the board in trust. Trust in government was always very low, but it's at just kind of unbelievable, extremes at the moment when you spend this much time demonizing the deep state. But I think also the polarization is something that's going to last a long time because Americans simply don't like each other. They don't trust each other. And you see this in little ways, like, when I post an interview, I do an interview with somebody, I get back, basically hate mail. It's not, oh, you said this, but I believe that you're wrong about it. It's, you're a disgusting elitist scum, this sort of thing. And I think that habit of routinely, it's what political scientists call effective polarization, where you're not disagreeing just over policies, you really hate the other side. And I think that's going to be hard to overcome down the road, long after Trump is gone.
Yeah, although, I mean, when I say that we should, in fairness, I mean, Trump is a symptom as much as a cause of a lot of that, right? We would not, but for the polarization that already existed, I don't think Trump would have won in 2016. Fluke that was. And then he made it worse, right?
Yeah, that's, you're absolutely right about that. I guess what I find really dismaying is that Trump has so many willing collaborators. He's got so many people that just come out of the woodwork and adopt his aggressive style and disrespect and hostility and so forth. And there just seems to be in American society an endless supply of these people right now. So yeah, I think that that's kind of what worries me going into the future.
So let me test out this theory on you. I used to be a big critic of horseshoe theory. I now have come around on it, in part because when I was a critic of it, illiberalism simply was not a part of modern American conservative dogma.
Right.
And so horseshoe theory, like the more you became like Milton Friedman, the closer you got to Stalin, made no sense to me, right? The more you were for limited government and revering the Constitution, that did not mean you were getting closer to totalitarianism, which is sort of what the old sort of Marxist version of American Marxist version of horseshoe theory said, which is that, the more further you move to the right in America, the closer you get to Nazism. The more you get to the left, you get to Stalinism. But the American right was not Nazi-ish, was not totalitarian. I'm not saying that everybody who believes in Trump is a Nazi or any of that kind of stuff. I am saying that the further you move into those swamps, the more illiberal it gets. And that's why horseshoe theory looks more accurate to me than it used to. At the same time, couldn't you, like, I'm one of these people, I said I'm a more passionate defender of the end of history than you are sometimes. And I mean that insofar as I think at the end of the day, this is culturally a liberal country. This is a country that, when Jimmy Carter and in the 1970s, the United States and Canada both told their citizens we're going to adopt a metric system, and the Canadians said, okay. And the Americans said, screw you, we're not doing that. That's witchcraft.
Right.
And I think that sort of innate, you're not the boss of me thing is inherent in American culture in ways that defy easy pigeonholing in one ideological camp or another. And I think that's an enduring part of our culture, that because fish don't know they're wet, Americans are kind of blind to the fact that we actually, in fact, have a culture. I could make the case that the illiberalism we're seeing from the right is a response to the growing illiberalism on the left, right? What you call woke liberalism, in your book on liberalism, which is a great book, you point out that the dominant theory of liberalism among theoreticians and political scientists is Rawlsian.
Right.
And I would argue that whatever Rawls's actual intent, where the rubber meets the road in terms of social justice movements or whatever you want to call them, that stuff is illiberal. It's identitarian. And so the response from the right to quote unquote woke liberalism had as its kernel a kind of liberal antibody response. The great tragedy is that Trump has yoked himself to that backlash that are in ways in and of itself illiberal. Is there hope in the future that Democrats, as they're licking their wounds now, that they actually become a classically liberal party again? Is it possible that the Republicans become because I think a lot of the time when people talk about threats to democracy and a lot of this boilerplate stuff, or the desire to return to common sense, that's playing upon the innate liberalness in the classical sense of the American people. And who can ever get on the right side of that, seems to me that's where an enduring majority may reside.
Yeah. Well, I don't know the answer to that, but let me elaborate on what you just said. So one of my great mentors, Seymour Martin Lipset, when he talked about American exceptionalism, said that one way that America is different is that conservatives in the United States are basically liberals. They're Lockean liberals that prize individualism, don't want the state to interfere in their lives, unlike European conservatives that were in favor of throne and altar and some higher form of authority, right? Now, I think that Trump has opened that box towards, and this is where the horseshoe comes in, where they're toying around with using state power to defeat woke liberalism, basically. So you see this with Ron DeSantis in Florida, scrutinizing textbooks and, making sure that the teachers are teaching, the right sort of doctrine. And, there's a much greater willingness to use the state in the economy. I mean, the whole tariff policy is all based on the state picking winners and losers, this sort of thing. And so, they are paving the way for a greater introduction of the state into politics and into the economy. However, there's still the libertarian side that hasn't gone away, that actually is represented by someone like Musk, where, he fundamentally does not want the state to tell Tesla or Starlink, what to do, and kind of believes in that older conservative libertarian view. So this is a way of saying, I don't know which way this is going to go, but there is going to be a fight over this, because I don't think that these two views of, how the state should or should not intervene are compatible with one another.
Yeah, so my concern there, I'm curious what you think about this. I have a friend who's been a close student of Peter Thiel's for a very long time. And, Peter Thiel is one of these figures who's looming in the background of a lot of this stuff. And Thiel used to be a hardcore libertarian, very smart guy, in artificial islands and, and all that stuff, and I like that Thiel. But his theory is that Thiel has concluded that America is going the way of oligarchy. And if that's the case, better to get out in front of it so that you're one of the oligarchs rather than not. And I worry that Musk, I haven't made up my mind about Mark Andreessen, but Musk and a lot of those people, that's their logic. And it's fine to say that I think you're right that Musk knows the arguments for the libertarian stuff. I think his instincts are sort of like a global libertarian thing. But he also is a captain of industry who wants to get to Mars and would rather have if the government's going to get in the business of doling out favors as a personalist regime, better be on the nice list than the naughty list. And that in and of itself becomes a corrupting catalytic force for, you'll still rhetorically be libertarian, but the reality is it's, subsidies for me, free markets for thee, right? For my friends, everything; for my enemies, the law kind of approach. And you can see the building blocks of that throughout what's going on in the Trump administration right now.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, the libertarianism of someone like Musk really only applies to his own companies and, his own realm. And I think that, what he's doing in this Doge operation is basically personalist, government. I mean, he personally is going to decide what's a legitimate expenditure and what's not, and go through the entire federal budget, and he alone is going to make these decisions. And so, yeah, it's not an ideologically consistent position. I think the whole question of oligarchy is one that we really haven't dealt with seriously as a country. Of course, we had, the Rockefellers and Mellons and so forth, in the late 19th century. There, the rest of the society was able to organize itself, to counteract the influence of oligarchs. And I think the oligarchs were different in those days, actually, because they still had a certain civic sense. Like J.P. Morgan intervened basically to save the country in the 1909 financial crisis. We didn't have a central bank at that time, and his bank kind of acted as the lender of last resort to get us out of that. And so I do think that they had a kind of civic commitment, and I don't see that really present in the current, set of oligarchs. And I think that, Musk has been toying with, some really nasty kind of racial, ethno-nationalist kind of stuff. His support for the AfD in Germany speaks to a European, quite frankly, a kind of much more European status form. So you're right that he's a funny mixture, and I think the natural evolution of these people is not to follow any predetermined set of ideas, but simply to follow kind of self-interest, and that's going to lead them, I think, probably into support for a certain kind of statism.
So you mentioned Seymour Martin Lipset, who was a hero of mine. I knew him a little bit back in the day. He was the one who first pointed out to me the Canadians and Americans doing the metric system stuff. It was one of his favorite little idnots. One of his famous sayings was, if you only know one country, you know no country.
Right.
And, one of the great things about your political origins books is the sort of sweeping eye of God. Here's how these things happened over vast swaths of time, kind of thing. There are these moments in history where, particularly in the West, but I think it's a global phenomenon, where there seem to be these spontaneous happenings or these contagious happenings, right? In 1968, there were student protests in Mexico City. There were student protests in, obviously, Prague, in the United States, all over the place. 1848 spread like wildfire, too. And one of the things that I think pushes back a little bit on the Trump as sui generis problem of analysis is, you mentioned the AfD in Europe. There are very few places left in the West which are not struggling with populism, nationalism, serious, whether you want to call them xenophobic or just anti-immigrant backlashes. Do you have a broader theory of the case? Is this all downstream of the financial crisis in 2007, 2008? Is it a backlash against neoliberalism, which, you're probably harsher on than I am? If you were a historian writing 100 years from now, like, what do you think would be the explanations for why this is not a uniquely American phenomena?
Well, I'm pretty convinced that it's not simply an economic phenomenon. I mean, this was common after 2016 to say, well, it's globalization, neoliberalism, people left behind. But if you look at who's really angry and who's really mobilized, it doesn't necessarily correspond to those people left behind. It really, there are these other cultural factors that intervened. I would say that, and it's also the reason I don't think it's about the material distribution of resources is, for that reason that there's a lot of very well-to-do people that are also joining in. I mean, all these oligarchs are incredibly mad about, disrespect, and I think
Mm-hmm.
actually that's the currency of the current inequality. It's an inequality of respect. This is the theme of thumos that I've talked
Mm-hmm.
about through almost all of my books, that people don't simply desire material resources, they desire respect. And I think in many countries, there's been a unequal distribution of respect that, you do have this emergence of, a professional class that now really controls the Democratic Party in the United States, but also the mainstream parties in Europe that are educated, that, have certain views of the world, and they, fundamentally don't respect people that are not like themselves. And I think a lot of the anger comes from that lack of respect. If you think about the oligarchs themselves, they're very mad that, the country wasn't incredibly grateful to them for making all these big companies and creating all this wealth. Um, as I understand it, part of the reason that Mark Zuckerberg has taken this shift towards Trumpism is that he actually feels he did a lot to answer the challenges of disinformation after 2016, and nobody gave him any credit for that. They
Mm-hmm.
still continued to, to dump on him and demonize him and so forth. And so I think that um, the technological side of this is also important, because who is it that distributes respect in the current world? A lot of that has moved to social media, or, kind of technologically mediated fora where people can either be disrespected or, supported in ways that really escape the control of all of the traditional institutions that used to distribute respect. So that may be, I think part of the explanation, that if you're simply thinking in these old uh, kind of Marxist terms, and in terms of who's got material wealth and how they're using it, I don't think that really explains, what's been going on.
Yeah, I mean, Jonathan Rausch, friend of mine, friend of the podcast, he's got this new book about religion, and part of his argument is that he was very, very wrong about dismissing the importance of religion in public life. And it seems to me that one aspect of that is religion, Christianity, but also Judaism and Islam and all these. There's a superstructure to them that is a different stratum of identity that conveys a sense of status and obligation independent of the market,
Right.
or social media and that kind of thing. And so the decline of religion as a living force in daily life, it strips things down to competitions of status, and essentially, and the problem with status is it's a positional good, right?
Right.
It's like
Right.
if you have high status, it comes at the expense of somebody else's status, or at least that's the way it feels to our lizard brains. And
Hmm.
um, that's a difficult problem to solve. It doesn't lend itself towards a public policy program.
No, no. Well, you think about how the media has shifted to the internet and to influencers instead of kind of legacy, media sources. Having started my own YouTube channel, and finding it really hard to attract followers, in a way, social media gives you immediate feedback on your status, right? That people like what you say or they disregard it. And I think that it has intensified this kind of inequality in status, where people can see their friends that are getting more likes than they are. And, it actually, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his discourse on the origins of inequality, said that human unhappiness began the first moment people came together in society and they were able to compare themselves to other people.
Right.
And if you think, what does social media do? It's exactly that. It's this instant way of seeing your status relative to that of your peers and famous people and, other people that are out there. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's made people so intensely unhappy. I remember my wife was on Facebook for a couple of years briefly, and then she got off because she says, I don't want to see this stuff about all the great vacations all of our friends have had.
Right.
Um,
No, it calls to mind there's a great quote from Montesquieu where he says, if one only wished to be happy, this could be easily accomplished. But we wish to be happier than other people, and this is always difficult, for we believe other people to be happier than they are.
Right, right.
And that's the problem. And in the attention economy, in the sort of status economy measured by clicks and that kind of thing, they're basically envy generating machines, and envy is deeply poisonous to social trust and the proper functioning of society.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, there's this, I talked about this in terms of these two concepts of isothumia and megalothumia. That isothumia is the expectation of a liberal society that everybody is respected. Everybody is given an equal degree of respect as a citizen, as a subject of a democratic republic. But, the world isn't satisfied with that, and people want to be respected, more respected than their fellows. And a lot of human happiness derives from that. You can't do away with that because you couldn't have any form of human excellence if certain people didn't want to be great, wide receivers or pianists or guitar players or, or whatever. But, that immediately creates unhappiness on the part of people that strive and are not respect. I think that explains a lot of Donald Trump, and Vladimir Putin. I mean, Trump, went to that famous White House Correspondents' Dinner where Obama made fun of him.
Right.
And I think his entire presidency can be understood in terms of his wanting to get back at the people that made fun of him. Obama's the chief villain in the other story with Putin, too, because at one point Obama said that Russia was a regional power. And this really got under Putin's skin, that we're not a regional power. We are a great power, and I'm going to prove it to you. And so in many respects, those two individuals, a lot of their motivation can be seen as trying to show the people that disrespected them that they actually were really wrong.
This is a strange question, but this territorial expansion stuff, which has taken everybody by surprise and has nothing to do with getting the price of eggs lower or anything like that, right? My colleague at the Dispatch, Nick Katojo, he made a point which I'm annoyed with myself for it having not occurred to me, which is that there is something inherent in the arguments and the logic of nationalism that lead inexorably, given the opportunity, right? Because opportunism is a big part of all of these things, towards the argument for expansion, right? It's as if somebody had said to Donald Trump, Putin's a great man of history because he's expanding Russia. That's what people who want to really be of consequence and remembered by history do. And if you're looking for a benchmark of how you made America great, getting Alaska or the Louisiana Purchase, those are the kinds of things that guarantee you a place in a history book. What do you think of that? Do you think that this is an inherent, that it is a natural sort of epiphenomenon of the nationalist way of looking at things, or is this just some sort of weird fluke because Steve Bannon said something about William McKinley to Donald Trump?
No, I don't think it's inherent. I mean, for a 70-year period after 1945, basically everybody in the world eschewed that understanding of what it meant to be a great power. That Germany and Japan had territorial ambitions, and they were so thoroughly defeated. And I think what they wanted to prove after that was that you could be great by building your economy, by selling things to everybody else in the world, and you did not actually need territory to do that. And actually, I think that modern economics, proves in spades that that's correct. The richest countries in the world are not the largest. In that case, Russia should be towering over all of us, but they're actually the ones like Switzerland that can make, the best use of the territory they've got and produce things that people want. And that was a perfectly good and much better understanding of national identity than, the old version that said it's just about land. One of the big questions I've got is how the American people are going to react to this new idea.
Mhm.
I can actually easily imagine that if Trump actually plants an American flag over Greenland, that in another 50 years, kids will open up their geography books and there'll be a big American flag over this big island, and people will feel pretty good about that. That was a great president that actually added this to our national patrimony. But the trouble is that this just opens a door to this pre-1945 world where, because we're not the only people that are going to think like this, right? And I think that if China is, China has been actively thinking about retaking Taiwan, using force if necessary. This is just an open invitation for them to do that. Yeah, you're right. Great powers have spheres of influence. We have a much stronger claim to Taiwan than America does to Greenland. And so we're going to simply act on that. We're just following in your footsteps. And so I think, that's why the understanding of what nationalism was changed after 1945, because that form of understanding led to total disaster, total global disaster.
But I mean, doesn't it depend a lot on how we acquire Greenland? Like, I'm very frustrated because I actually am very sympathetic. I've been arguing for acquiring Greenland for a long time, peacefully,
Yeah.
right? Like, make an offer, buy them out. It's less of it was a much more compelling idea under Truman because we didn't have NATO yet. And so some of the geostrategic arguments for controlling Greenland go away when Denmark becomes one of the founding charter members of NATO, because you get the alliance. The alliance checks a lot of those boxes. But still, like, if it was for sale, I'm very open to the idea of buying it. What I'm not in favor of is when he says he will not rule out the use of force, which I go back and forth about how serious he was about that. I think he just likes to intimidate people and likes to sound tough and doesn't like to limit his options. But at the same time, you just don't talk about use of force to seize territory from a NATO ally.
No.
It's just, it's insane.
Yeah.
And, but so I agree with you. Look, if he could work out a deal, the art of the deal, and he bought Greenland, even if he talked a little too tough for my tastes, that'd be one thing. If he sends the Seventh Fleet, I don't know that the American people are going to stand for it,
Yeah.
but I've been wrong about what the American people will stand for before.
Well, I don't think he's going to have to send the Seventh Fleet, but I do think that he likes to be a bully, and he believes that that helps him, domestically, if he's seen as a guy that's not intimidated by, world opinion, and he'll just, take what he can get. But I don't think he's going to need to send troops to get Greenland. I mean, basically, the Danes have told us that we could have whatever we wanted, we just negotiate for it. They want a bigger base in Greenland, you want to exploit minerals, that's all open and we can do that. But he doesn't want to simply make this a peaceful negotiation, because I think he likes the aggression. That's part of the norm breaking that has gotten him where he is right now. And he's going to be the first American president in the last 100 years to actually think that, yes, if we have the power to grab territory, we ought to do it.
Yeah, again, I'm not saying that Trump is Hitler, but it does. It is a little reminiscent of Hitler's position about the Sudeten Germans in Czechoslovakia. He didn't want all the appeasement. He didn't want the deal. He wanted the war with to take it, and he got very angry every time Chamberlain or anybody else worked out a deal that avoided war because that wasn't the goal. I'm not saying that Trump wants war with Denmark, but it's sort of like his statements about tariffs until he backed down this week. He was asked, is there anything Canada and Mexico can do on Friday in the Oval Office to avoid this? And he says, no, this is an economic decision. This is not a negotiating tactic. He thinks tariffs are good in and of themselves.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's a problem.
And he thinks aggression is good in itself. I mean,
right.
His demonstration of aggression.
So of all of these things that are going, well, I should back up just very quickly. In the Yasha Monk conversation, people sent it to me thinking I would have this great objection to it. I didn't. But part of your argument is that bureaucrats are actually too hamstrung.
Yes.
Like we need stronger bureaucrats. Can you just sort of lay that out and then we'll take it from there?
Yeah. So I think that Doge's analysis, or the conservative analysis, that the problem with the federal bureaucracy is that they're out of control and are pursuing an independent liberal agenda is 180 degrees wrong. The reason that the bureaucracy is so dysfunctional is that we have layered on top of them mountains of rules, and bureaucrats spend all of their time trying to figure out how to comply with these rules. As an example, there are something like over 10,000 annual reports that different agencies have to file with Congress. They're mandated to do this. It's a total waste of time. Nobody reads them. You cannot buy an office desk without complying with the federal acquisitions regulations that are hundreds of pages of detailed rules about how a federal agency has to buy something. And I think that that's the problem with the bureaucracy. We have plenty of ways of telling bureaucrats what to do. The political principals can tell the bureaucratic agents what to do. And the problem is that those agents don't have enough flexibility to use their own judgment as to how to go about, getting actual results. And so that's the broader argument. Now, that's not an argument for concentrating all the discretionary power in the White House. That's really what's going on right now. Congress makes the decisions about spending, about programs, policies, and the bureaucracy carries out their wishes. But they just need more freedom to actually figure out how to best accomplish what Congress wants them to do than they have at the moment. So, there's a different analysis of bureaucratic dysfunction. I agree with, conservatives that the bureaucracy is dysfunctional, but I think the source of that dysfunction is kind of the opposite of what they think it is. So that, that's.
Yeah, so I'm sympathetic to a lot of that. Bureaucrats are inevitable in any modern state. So if we're going to have them, let's have good ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think is the way to think of it. My colleague Kevin Williamson, talks about how the Swiss just have good bureaucrats, and people want good bureaucrats when they get their driver's license renewed or they need a permit for something and that kind of thing. No one says, "Oh, it's terrible that these guys are so competent." So I agree with that. I think you're being maybe a little dismissive, though, of the way in which what you've been calling woke liberalism is pushed through the bureaucratic mechanisms. I mean, the Title IX stuff that has been promulgated on college campuses, that kind of thing.
Look, I think there are definitely areas where that conservative complaint is correct, and Title IX is one of them. The Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education basically did this vast expansion of Title IX. I mean, as an academic, I have to get training every year, Title IX training on, what you can and can't say about transgender people. So there are definitely areas in which that critique is really justified. They should have put that through an APA process, notice and comment, and so forth, and they didn't do that. So I'm granting that. But the bigger problem really has to do with this overregulation of bureaucrats that affects, virtually everything a bureaucrat does to a much greater extent than the areas where they have too much freedom.
Yeah, no, that I'm simple. I mean, this is sort of the Ezra Klein stuff these days, right?
Yeah.
Is that he wants? I mean, there are two arguments. I'm more on the Virginia Postrel side, but I'm more of a both and than anything else, which is that we can't build stuff in part because government is hamstrung by regulations.
Yeah.
and we can't build stuff in part because the private sector is hamstrung by regulations that are a knock-on effect of some of those regulations.
Yeah,
And like,
yeah.
and so I mean, but Mansur Olson, would make the case that the way you get through this sclerosis is with a war. Is it
Yeah.
possible
Well,
that
war with Denmark, I mean,
yeah,
what could
that'll
be
do it.
better?
No, but is it possible that Trump's bull in a china shop approach, as much as I have problems with huge chunks of it, that there could be some creative destruction that comes out of it? I mean, I don't think the Democrats are going to come back with the DEI stuff if they get back into power all too quickly, because they'd have to run on it, right? You'd have to say, when we get it back in power, we're going to bring that stuff back, and that's a losing proposition. So most executive orders are kind of last as long as until the next one, and they're kind of written on water. But some of these, I think, are going to be lasting because it's a correction of catching up where the political zeitgeist is. Is it possible that like some of this bull in the china shop stuff could, in a post-Trump world, be something to build on?
Well, it's possible. If Harris had been elected, we wouldn't get any reform of the bureaucracy. And the reason for that is that the Democratic Party is way too beholden to the public sector unions that are simply defending the status quo. So it could be that if they have a near-death experience, so the Democratic Party will wake up to the fact that they've got to fix this stuff and really do some serious deregulation. There's a Michigan law professor, Nick Bagley, who's written, I think, brilliantly on this. He says that the trouble is that liberals and progressives want to use the government to do stuff, but they think that legitimacy comes from procedures, and they're constantly adding new procedures that then get in the way of their actually being able to do anything. And the way that a Democrat has succeeded is by actually cutting away those procedures, like Josh Shapiro rebuilding I-95 after that big accident. He literally could not rebuild it, legally, because there are too many rules that he would have had to violate. And so, he figured out a way to suspend those rules in order to get the actual result done in 2 weeks. And so I think if more Democrats accepted that reality and realized that, yes, we do actually need to deregulate, some of these constraints on government, that people prize outcomes much more than they do procedures. And we are being much too procedural in the way we're proceeding.
One might think that this is part of the problem with the decline of religion, is that we have to create new dogmas to decorate everything with. All right, so I want to respect your time, and I know we're coming up at the end of the hour, but just curious of your thoughts about it. So I think the argument about the broad picture argument about the end of history is still correct. That I'm with Calvin Coolidge, who says we just can't improve upon the basic principles of the American founding. Any attempt to do so is a move backwards towards old understandings of the role of politics, whether it's monarchism or personalism or nationalism or tribalism and all of these kinds of things. Is that basically the summit is liberal democratic capitalism. I'm not quite the getting to Denmark guy that you are, but that's fine. But I'm wondering, I sometimes think, I'm curious what you think about this analogy. My colleague at AEI, Rui Teixeira, wrote a very misunderstood book about the emerging democratic majority, which was taken in the Obama era to mean demographics is destiny. America's getting non-white. We will be permanently in power because we believe in diversity, and white people are no longer necessary to electoral success, which was completely misreading and wrong. But Roy and John Judas got kind of stuck with that. I think part of the problem with the end of history thing is you got stuck with saying something that you weren't saying. I'm sure you have no anecdotes to back up that observation, but the problem with it is that the spirit of a declaration of victory was an open door for a sort of Rawlsian approach to things, right? My last book, which draws a lot on your work, my big argument is that what is poisoning America and Western democracy generally is ingratitude. Because when you're grateful for something, you want to maintain it. You want to sustain it, right? You don't want it to be to go into disrepair and to rot and decay. But if you love your boat, you know that every weekend you got to scrub the barnacles and keep it clean, right? And that's what we're supposed to be doing with institutions. That's what we're supposed to be doing with the Constitution, is having gratitude for it, for being lifted out of 300,000 years of poverty. And that's what liberal democratic capitalism did. And it feels to me that so much of the politics of the left and the right, both the Trumpian stuff, the nationalist stuff, the post-liberal stuff, the woke stuff, all of that, these are things that you do when you take for granted, right? When a spirit of ingratitude, you think, the system just works. It's a perpetual motion machine. We don't need to maintain it. Nat Glazer had this great quote in the early 90s about how cities went wrong when they stopped focusing on the things that they knew how to do in favor of the things that they thought they ought to do, right? This utopian schemes about fixing inequality and all, eradicating racism, rather than collecting garbage and fighting crime,
right,
and all that sort of stuff. And so it seems to me that's part of the consequence of, I'm not putting it all on your shoulders, but this attitude of ingratitude, which says we have to come up with something new and transgressive and interesting. Let's come up with colonial oppressor theory, all of these kinds of things. They take for granted that liberal democratic capitalism is a steady state thing and doesn't need any maintenance. And when you think that, you start grabbing really old ideas, thinking that they're new and interesting and cool because they get a reaction from people and they confer status. But the problem with them is, A, they're not new, and B, they're very, 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 very wrong. And we've had these arguments before, which is why liberalism emerged in the first place. Anyway, that's my sort of grand, sort of partial criticism, partial defense of you and the end of history thesis.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think that one of the big, and you see this, by the way, in Eastern Europe and these former communist countries, that you have an entire generation that's grown up since the collapse of communism, since 1989, and they are living in a peaceful, prosperous world. And I think you're absolutely right. They take that for granted and they say, yeah, that's good. They had no direct experience of tyranny, of aggression, of bombed out cities, and so they think that that's the normal condition of mankind, is to live as they do in contemporary Europe or North America, and then they can fantasize about the European Union or the Obama administration being the height of tyranny. This is the thing that really annoys me about some of the post-liberal advocates, that say that we need post-liberalism because we're living in this monstrous tyranny of woke liberalism right now, which I just think is a pile of crap. So yes, you're absolutely right. That is a good argument. I don't believe that I had a chapter in the original End of History that was entitled No Democracy Without Democrats, meaning that you had to exert agency constantly in order to get to democracy. It wasn't just an inevitable thing where this big mechanism called history with a capital H produced this outcome and that's it. If you don't keep working at it, you're not gonna keep it. And I think we're seeing the results of that right now.
All right. I'm always happy to end with Francis Fukuyama telling me I'm absolutely right. So with that, thank you so much for doing this. I'll put links to all your stuff in the show notes and all of that. And you're welcome to come back anytime.
Okay.
Love having you.
Great, Jonah. Thanks a lot.